I have the distinct pleasure of introducing these two wonderful authors. Keith Stavely and Kathleen Fitzgerald have written a remarkable publication that explores the old phrase, "you are what you eat." I couldn't help it. I put that in there. But their book, United Tastes, the making of the first American cookbook, which is published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2017, and I think in the winter of 2017, gives voice to the social conditions and the culinary traditions of our country. And it really is a wonderful book. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I think you'd enjoy it. Anyone with an American Studies, public history type bent will really enjoy this book. Connecticut State Historian Dr. Walter Woodward says of United Tastes, a new book about America's first cookbook turns out to be the best nook on Connecticut history in a long time. Join me in welcoming these two masterful researchers and delightful public historians to our city, Keith Stavely and Kathleen Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Brenda, for that that's such a fulsome introduction. Perhaps you've learned enough about the book already. You don't need really to hear from us, but we will proceed. I really do want to thank Brent. Can you hear me, by the way? First of all, is the microphone working okay? Really do want to thank Brenda for everything that she did to set up this event, and we're just delighted to be able to make a presentation about our book in this absolutely magnificent facility that is dedicated to the history of Hartford. And she didn't perhaps stress as much as she might have that not only is this a book about Connecticut history in many ways, but there is quite a bit specifically about Hartford. So if you are particularly interested in that aspect of Connecticut, then that may be another reason why you might be interested in our book. I also want to thank Laurie Bompard from Barnes & Noble right across the street for handling, bringing copies of the book for those of you who might be interested in taking a look at them after we finish talking. And also Jasmine Augusto from staff member here at the History Center for helping with the technological arrangements, which would be, a bit of a mystery to us if we didn't have her help. So thank you for that, Jazz. Okay, so let's proceed with what we have to say about our book. According to the Library of Congress, American Cookery by Amelia Simmons is one of the 88 books that shaped America. Let's see if I'm holding this right. There we go. Sitting on the library's list right alongside The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Alcoholics Anonymous, which you see on the upper right of that screenshot, and American Cookery, a modern reprint edition, is in the middle on the top row there, and other titles. Yet despite this billing as an important and influential work, American Cookery has yet to be analyzed and interpreted in context and understood as a product of early America. Our book, United Tastes, is designed to fill this gap. Let's begin with the basics. American Cookery was initially published, which is, partly main reason why we're here today, in Hartford, right here in Hartford, in the spring of 1796. 6 months later, a revised edition was published someplace else in Albany, New York. In both editions, the author is identified on the title page as, wait a minute, what happened there? Oh, there's okay. As Amelia Simmons. This is going a little, I'm pressing it too hard perhaps. Okay, there's the Albany publication. And as I said, the author identification in both editions is given as Amelia Simmons, an American Orphan. There's the Hartford version of that, and here is the Albany version of that. There's the author identification in the Albany edition. There were several other printings during the first 3 decades of the 19th century, most of them based on the second or Albany edition. Here is the Salem, New York, 1804 edition, and there was even an edition 12 years after that, way out in Ohio, Zanesville, Ohio. in 1816. The work was also plagiarized 4 times during these same decades, as in this 1808 Montpelier, Vermont retitled version, which takes large parts of American cookery without attribution. This printing history alone would seem to justify the Library of Congress's billing of the book as an important and influential work. But how specific, a work that shaped America. But how specifically did it shape, or how specifically was it designed to shape the America of its own day? In United Tastes, we explore this question from 2 angles: that of the book's of American cookery's culinary content, and that of its author's intriguing identity as an orphan. I'll be talking about the culinary content, and Kathy about the authorial identity. There were 3 major factors, so on to my part of the culinary content. There were 3 major factors that converged to produce this inaugural American cookbook. First, what historians over the last couple of decades have come to call the consumer revolution of the 18th century. Second, the desire among many people in post-revolutionary America to have independence spread beyond politics into all aspects of how people lived. And third, there was competition among the regions of the new nation, which generally are described as New England, the Middle States, and the South, for leadership of these efforts towards full national autonomy. So I'll move on to the first of those 3 things. The consumer revolution of the 18th century brought, among other things, new styles in architecture. Just on Thursday, we gave a talk on Plymouth Plantation. If you've ever been there, a talk at Plymouth Plantation, you know, the reconstructed 17th century settlement. If you've ever visited there, you can see that these styles of domestic architecture are quite different from what you see from, 100 years before that at Plymouth Plantation. Anyway, architecture, furniture, clothing, and tableware brought new styles in all these areas to British North America. It also brought a huge increase in the number and types of books that were available, including English cookbooks. In 1742, there was a colonial edition of this book, The Complete Housewife, by someone who's given on the title page as E. Smith. Nobody's sure what her first name was. In 1772, there was a Boston printing of this book, The Frugal Housewife, by a woman named Susanna Carter. It had first been published in London a few years before that. In between those dates, this book, The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy by Hannah Glass, that was the most popular English cookbook of the 18th century. And it was, even though there was no reprint of it over here, but it was just as popular, nevertheless, on this side of the Atlantic as it was in Great Britain. On to the second of the 3 factors I mentioned, the efforts that were made in the aftermath of the American Revolution towards economic and cultural independence. This took various forms. One was that at George Washington's first inauguration in 1789, the cloth for the suits worn by Washington and other dignitaries, including John Adams, the vice president, and the members of Congress from Connecticut, this cloth was made by an American firm, the Hartford Woolen Manufactory, which was located right here in Hartford, of course. And that slide is Washington's actual suit. Another example of these efforts is, of course, the little book that is our principal subject, filled with recipes that the title page claims are adapted to this country. Like the inaugural apparel, as I've indicated already, American cookery was produced in Hartford. Unfortunately, these Americanizing efforts were not always successful. Just 4 or 5 years after Washington's first inauguration, the Hartford Woolen Manufactory had failed. Often American producers just didn't have the resources to compete successfully with well-established British producers. For example, there was a demand among Americans for tableware decorated with patriotic symbols. But ironically, this wasn't produced by American potters, but by British firms like that of Josiah Wedgwood. He successfully exported to this country teapots, bowls, and plates depicting American victories in the Revolution, such as the surrender at Yorktown, seen in this slide. So an apparent proclamation of American independence in the realm of ceramics was actually, when you know a little bit about it, a confession of ongoing dependence on the former mother country. It was the same with American cookery. In this supposed declaration of culinary independence, about 1/3 of the recipes, remember I mentioned a few minutes ago that there were books after it was first published that came out that plagiarized from American cookery. Well, American cookery itself is 1/3 plagiarized from British cookbooks. Mostly the three that I mentioned earlier by E. Smith, Susanna Carter, and Hannah Glass. A slightly larger number are of a type that were frequently found in British cookbooks. In other words, about 3/4 of the content of this book that's called American Cookery is actually totally British content. Once again, so in other words, just as with those patriotic tableware that was made by Wedgwood, this aspiration to fuller independence in the realm of cuisine and food and cookbooks really conceals an unacknowledged continuing dependence on Great Britain. However, all is not lost. The fact that American cookery and many other Americanizing initiatives followed British models doesn't mean that we should think of them as of no significance. And we can begin to understand what this significance was by looking at the third of the three themes that I talked about, listed briefly earlier, the regional competition for national leadership. The two main examples we've given of nationalistic assertion both came from, as you probably are clear by now, from Hartford. Here's a view of Hartford from around this time. There were many other such efforts launched from Hartford right after the Revolution. You may or may not be aware of this, but by the mid-1780s, a group of young men, including the former Yale tutor and current poet, and subsequently the president of Yale, Timothy Dwight, and also the poet Joel Barlow, were living in or near Hartford and devoting themselves to writing poems about the present or future greatness of this new country, the United States. Literary historians call this group the Connecticut Wits, and there's actually a picture of Barlow along with Dwight and another friend of theirs that was involved in this, John Trumbull. Closely associated with the Connecticut Wits was a classmate of Barlow's and former student of Dwight's by the name of Noah Webster. When we were here earlier for an interview with Brenda Miller and Walt Woodward, the state historian, we got to chat with Brenda a little bit afterwards, and she showed us around the History Center here, and she mentioned that they have a really splendid collection of Noah Webster's papers here. So if you're interested in him, please come and take a look at what the treasures that are here. Anyway, Webster's highly successful literary project, the guy who was president of Yale when he was a student there, Ezra Stiles, Webster went and sought advice from him when he was working on getting this book published, and Stiles insisted that he give it this very dignified title, The Grammatical Institute of the English Language, Part 1. There were two other parts to follow. But the book actually was quite a success within quite soon after it was published. And, you know, the people are often wiser than those who think that they know a lot. And the readers of this book soon called it Webster's Blueback Speller, and that's how it came to be known for years and decades after this. And again, when we were here for this interview, we were informed, which we didn't know until then, by Walt Woodward, that in West Hartford, where Webster is from, there's a square that's actually called Blueback Square after this fact that this, incredibly successful project of his had that name. This book, Webster's Blueback Speller, was intended to was another one of these Americanizing efforts that were going on at this time. It was intended to create for the United States an Americanized language based, as Webster said in the preface to this first part of it, on the same Republican principles as American civil and ecclesiastical institutions. Most of these Hartford books that were asserting American cultural independence were published by the same publisher, Hudson and Goodwin. The owners of this firm, Barzillai Hudson and George Goodwin, were also the owners of Hartford's leading newspaper. I'm sure you know what that is, the Connecticut Current, which, again, I'm sure you also know, still publishes today as the Hartford Current, and as you can see on the masthead there, is in fact America's oldest continuously published newspaper. It started about 30 years before the publication of American Cookery in the 1760s. In 1796, as we've already indicated, Hudson and Goodwin also published the book that we're here to talk about, American Cookery. It wasn't a coincidence that American Cookery was first published in the same place and by the same publishers as were the works of the Connecticut Wits and Noah Webster. The Connecticut Wits, Webster, and their publishers, Hudson and Goodwin, were all Federalists in their political outlook. If you remember the kind of major political factions that emerged in these early years of the American nation, the Federalists and on the one hand, but in the 1780s, before these parties had emerged, the name Federalist meant people that supported the new Constitution, the new federal Constitution of 1787. So these guys were all Federalists when it meant that, but then in the 1790s, when these parties did begin to emerge, the Federalists and their opponents, then being a Federalist meant opposition to these opponents, and these opponents they were called Republicans, and they espoused a more radically egalitarian form of republicanism, and their leader, of course, was Thomas Jefferson, who's here being in this cartoon, or this, not sure exactly what it is, but Jefferson is being contrasted unfavorably with George Washington in that slide. With a cookbook, so coming back to these gentlemen in Connecticut who were doing all these projects, Americanizing projects, and were Federalists in their political outlook, what we argue they were doing with this cookbook, American Cookery, was the fact that they were bringing out a cookbook that espoused what we call moderate gentility. They were seeking to extend this Americanizing campaign of theirs into the realm of everyday life. But with a cookbook written by someone who was not only a woman, but also an orphan. Whoops, what happened there? I hit the wrong button. Sorry. Thank you. Yes, technology challenge resolved immediately. Remember, thank you very much. Let's see. With a cookbook written by someone who was not only a woman, but also an orphan, they were seeking to broaden their appeal of this kind of Americanism that they were propagating beyond just this circle of gentlemen and upper class people, but into a kind of a broader group. Now, here's the thing that you might particularly appreciate, since we're speaking here in Hartford. Underlying this Connecticut effort to claim cultural leadership of the new nation, the United States, was a conviction shared by all of Connecticut's leading citizens, and perhaps it's shared by you now, that their state was superior to all others. It was taken for granted by everyone in New England at this time that New England was the best region, compared to the middle states in the South. But in Connecticut, they went beyond that. They were really mainly thinking of, whenever the times we've given this talk in Massachusetts locations, I always stick in, take that Massachusetts, because they were really thinking that, Massachusetts always thought of itself as the original place and the primary place, but these people were convinced that Massachusetts should take, a distant second place to Connecticut. So this is what these people thought. Jedediah Morse, the father of the inventor of the telegraph, was another, and this portrait of him was painted by his son. He was a portrait painter as well as the inventor of the telegraph. He was another recent Yale graduate associated with the Connecticut Wits. In 1789, in his own Americanizing project, a book entitled American Geography, Morse described Connecticut as a well-cultivated garden which, with that degree of industry that is necessary to happiness, produces the necessaries and conveniencies of life in great plenty. In his 1794 poem Greenfield Hill, our Timothy Dwight, the gentleman whose picture I showed you earlier, depicted Connecticut as a paradise of relatively equal, modestly thriving farmers. Every house on its own ground, and every happy swain beholding no superior but the laws. Connecticut thought of itself as orderly, prosperous, and equal. It also thought of itself as a place where good manners and cultivated modes of living were encouraged. And now we return to, I actually went to the slide before I meant to. This thing has a mind of its own. This is the, coming back now to that consumer revolution that I talked about a bit before. This is a shot of the May 9th, 1796 issue, page 3 of that issue of the Connecticut Current. At the bottom of column 2, we're going to have a close-up of that later on in the talk, but at the bottom of column 2 is the copyright announcement for American Cookery. But the reason we're bringing it up now is that this page in particular, as well as other pages in the issue, contained a whole bunch of advertisements for the apparatus of a refined way of life, such as a genteel house with a back kitchen, furniture crafted, here's an example of a dining table from this period, furniture crafted in the newest, neatest, and best manner. Fine fabrics such as India satins and lute strings for making top quality clothing, and tableware for elegant dining, such as green, blue, and plain-edged plates and oval dishes of all sizes, fluted and fancy cups and saucers. Of course, there would have been no dining, fine or otherwise, were there not an array of excellent foods on Connecticut tables. During the Revolutionary War, Connecticut earned the title the Provisions State because of its success in supplying the Continental Army with food and drink. After the war, Timothy Dwight claimed that in New Haven, meat, fish, fruit, and vegetables were all abundantly available. And according to the same issue of the Connecticut Current that we looked at before, the same page even of that issue, also for sale in Connecticut were beverages, spices, and other enhancements obtained through maritime commerce with which to concern Connecticut's agricultural plenty into gastronomically appealing meals. Rum, brandy, wines, you can see this in the slide, rum, brandy, wines of different kinds, molasses, loaf, lump, and brown sugars, pimento, coffee, chocolate, pepper, raisins, nutmegs, cassia, cinnamon. So, American Cookery was designed to promote and encourage this image of a Connecticut filled with relatively equal, modestly prosperous households. The title page says that the recipes are adapted not just to this country, but also to all grades of life. When the recipes in the book are grouped with this phrase, all grades of life, in mind, it turns out that a few of them, and we did categorize them this way in the book, it turns out that a few of them are quite simple and plain, a few more are quite fancy and elegant, and the great majority fit into a middle category that we call prosperous. So the book's overall culinary content proclaims a shared American prosperity. In addition, popular dishes such as Indian pudding are also offered in different versions to fit all grades of life, from plain, that's the one on the bottom, which has almost nothing added to it, and it's boiled rather than baked. Plain to moderately enhanced, that's the one in the middle, and it has, you know, butter and eggs and sweetener and everything, and spice. To elegant, that's the fanciest one, is the one on top that has all the things that the one in the middle has, along with raisins. And it's only sugar rather than cheaper molasses. Likewise, pumpkin pie, this is a shot of the recipe as it appears in the book, or there's actually two recipes, can be made either with inexpensive molasses and no particular effort put into the bottom crust. And by the way, this is the first printed recipe for the type of pumpkin pie that has become the standard one that we all have at Thanksgiving. If you're interested in finding out more about that, we can tell you about an English type of pumpkin pie that existed before this that was very different from what we think of as pumpkin pie. So, but the American Cookery gives either that version or a fancier one with sugar instead of molasses and with flaky puff pastry both bottom and top, and it even calls for the top crust to be decorated. It's unfortunate that this version of pumpkin pie has kind of been totally forgotten, because it is really good. One of the members of our audience has attended our Thanksgiving dinners, and she can verify that it's really delicious. She's not speaking quite loud and clear about that, but she would totally affirm that if you asked her. So anyway, in these various ways, American Cookery fits with the Connecticut self-image, offering guidance within the realm of cuisine on how to progress from plain to prosperous living. But you might ask, given that what I've said about the fact that there's only a very few of the recipes, or that most of the recipes are British rather than American, what is American about this whole thing? Given that the number of American recipes is not very great. But they are there. Besides the two already mentioned, Indian pudding and pumpkin pie, along with Johnny cake. There's the recipe, and here it is as we made it from that recipe. Indian slapjack, squash pudding, cranberry tart, and a few others. What we argue in our book is that even though there's only a few of them, they have an importance well beyond their numbers. Their role in American cookery is similar to the role played by the quaint local details depicted in many of the portraits of wealthy Connecticut citizens, or portrayed around this time by the artist Ralph Earl. And this is a picture of U.S. Senator Ralph Ellsworth and his wife. I'm sorry, right, Oliver Ellsworth. Pardon me, who lived in Windsor, just down the river from here. According to art historians, these people insisted that they be shown in their own environments with specific regional. What did I hit again? Is it this thing?
I think it's if you hit the center button.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
There we go. In their own environments with specific regional details. And this is what we're highlighting here is the fact that even though they're seated in a room in their own house in the foreground, kind of surrealistically in the background is the whole house. So you know exactly where you are if you are familiar with Connecticut. And this sort of sense of down-to-earth localism in these portraits is even enhanced further when these little regional details include relatively rustic features, such as, if you can see that there's various kinds of fencing in the portrait, and the one that's closest in the foreground in that close-up is just very plain rough-hewn rails. You know, farther closer to the house, there's like elegant white fencing. But so again, that sort of what they were attempting to how they were attempting to represent themselves, people like the Ellsworths, was that, you know, well, yeah, we're rich and we're wealthy and we're important, and we have all of this fancy stuff, but we're not, you know, way above everybody else. They were trying to portray themselves as not all that exalted, and we think that the point of these, most of them, kind of plain recipes for American dishes in American cookery has the same purpose. It gives the book a down-to-earth feel, thereby affirming American democracy, while at the same time the reader is invited into an expanding social world of culinary sophistication and refinement. With American cookery, with its lineup of foods, expressive of a society that was at once elegant and unpretentious, that maintained its ties to its British heritage, but was also ready to strike out on its own. The book was well designed, we argue, to participate by the efforts of the Federalists, in the effort by the Federalists of Connecticut to make their state vitally influential in the new American nation. And now Kathy is going to come up and tell you about the more sexy dimension of the book, which is the mystery about the author.
Take a look at this. Well, hello everyone, and I want to again thank Brenda and Jazz and everyone for helping us. Thank you, Jazz, to present to you today our take on American cookery. So, as Keith has said, I'm going to take up what we think is the really exciting part about the identity of the author. Who is Amelia Simmons? But first, let me make sure I can work this. Okay, great. So if American cookery is to be understood as part of the Federalist Project, as Keith has been describing, to define a new national character, then inevitably questions about who's this author, who took on this project, come to mind. Did a female orphan cook really take it upon herself to further the Federalist agenda with a publication aimed at housewives and servants, but subtly expressive of political values as we saw in the portraits of the Ellsworths? If this unknown author imagined and accomplished all this, then she's really an intriguing character. But we think it more likely that some combination of persons, whether it's someone working with her or impersonating her, were behind the creation of the first American cookbook. So, by inscribing under her name on the title page, as we've seen before, the tagline, "An American Orphan," the author both draws attention to her status, and she also offers clues about her identity. We can turn to the cookbook's preface to learn more, and that's what we're going to do now. Early editions, both early editions that Keith has been describing to you, both in 1796, the one from Hartford and the one from Albany, include prefaces. And there's also an errata page to a later printing of the first edition that also has a little bit more to say about this intriguing dimension of the book. There we learn that Amelia Simmons was no stranger to strife and trouble. So here's how the preface looks in the first edition. Oh, okay. And so here's some of what she says in the first edition. She bemoans the trials of females, who by the loss of their parents or other unfortunate circumstances are reduced to the necessity of going into families in the line of domestics or taking refuge with their friends or relations. Any young female orphan, she continues, though left to the care of virtuous guardians, will find it essentially necessary to have an opinion and determination of her own. The course she recommends for such women is an adherence to those rules and maxims which have stood the test of ages and will forever establish the female character, a virtuous character. Again, she reminds readers that unlike women who have parents or brothers or riches to defend their indiscretions, a poor, solitary orphan must depend solely upon character. And notice that the word character is emphasized by being in italics. Well, that's a lot about the perils facing female orphans in the preface to what is, after all, a cookbook. But such perils make up only a part of Simmons's tale of woe. In the errata page, she accuses an unnamed person of a design to impose on her and injure the sale of the book. The nefarious person with a design to impose on her had been someone quite close to her. It's someone she had entrusted with the receipts, meaning recipes, to get them ready for publication because she lacked an education sufficient to prepare the work for the press. Now, this suggests that she probably was unable to write. In the second edition, which we see here of American Cookery, the one published in Albany, there is again a preface to that edition, and it begins more conventionally by offering kind of polite thanks to the fashionable ladies. She calls them respectable characters who supported the first edition. In other words, promoted sales of the first edition. But then after that sort of very kind of standard thanks to these ladies, she's again complaining that the first edition included egregious blunders, which were occasioned either by the ignorance or evil intentions of the transcriber for the press, in an attempt to sidestep any criticism that the second edition might come in for. She reminds her readers to remember that it is the performance of and effected under all those disadvantages which usually attend an orphan. So these are rather peevish statements in the preface to a cookbook, and especially one claiming to introduce the world to a distinctly American style of cooking. So the prefaces we found had to be understood if we were to understand who Amelia Simmons was, and maybe to find out more about her. The issues of the day that Keith has been describing, from the consumer revolution to the search for defining a national character, to the status of orphans and women, we felt were the keys to understanding what these statements meant in the prefaces. For instance, with the consumer revolution and its increasingly elegant tableware and dining furniture that Keith was showing you, came, of course, an enthusiasm for better prepared foods, for well-prepared dishes. The middle class was rising, in essence. So we have an emphasis on foods like this a la mode a round of beef, which is a kind of pot roast but more elegantly prepared with wine and seasonings. We have a fowl smothered in oysters, another very, quite refined genteel dish. Stuffed bass and other stuffed fish. All kinds of cakes. This is a plum cake that we've made. Cookies, the term cookies was introduced for the first time in American Cookery in print. And of course the pies Keith was talking about earlier. Some with molasses, but others with the more expensive, more kind of refined style of cooking with sugar alone. And all of these foods were advertised right on the title page. Advertising happened that way in this late 18th century printing world. People would want to know what was in the book. They would find out by looking right at the title page, where it doesn't just say American Cookery, but lots of words are included in, so you're going to get viands, meaning food, fish, poultry, vegetables, paste, puffs. By the way, in the second edition, that was corrected. It was puff pastes. So they realized they, made it sound like two things, where it's really puff paste, and they did correct it. Pies, tarts, puddings. So all of this cakes, from the imperial plum to plain cake, it's meant to appeal to the book buyer, to get you to buy the book. But still, at the core of the book was a mystery. Did an ill-educated female orphan named Amelia Simmons really write it? an indication that perhaps the name Amelia Simmons, and perhaps the person, we're not sure, is a fiction, is found in this detail. After this edition rather, from Troy, New York in 1808, now that's only a short time after 1796, these further printings in other regions came out. The name Amelia Simmons, which you can see is printed right in, the printer has included it on the title page. After this, the name Amelia Simmons disappears from the title page of the book. All subsequent editions in this first printing period up through the 1830s, all subsequent editions except the one from farthest away in Zanesville, Ohio, that had the name Amelia Simmons, the rest dropped it. So I'm going to show you a few examples. So here you can see that a cataloger has written in Amelia Simmons, but this 1808 edition is just by an American orphan. This is the places unknown on this one. And then we have one from 1812 in Walpole, New Hampshire. She's missing. She's kind of missing in action here. 1814, an American orphan. This is Vermont, Brattleboro. Poughkeepsie, 1815. You can see she's nowhere to be found. This is 1819 in Brattleboro. There's another edition that I don't have a slide of 1822 from New York, where she's given as an American orphan. And then in the last edition of the book's first active period, from Woodstock, Vermont, 1831, she's not even an American anymore. She's only an orphan. So she's fading away as Amelia Simmons from her own book. Now, most imaginative and didactic works of the early national period went through numerous changes as new editions appeared. This was the case with Noah Webster's popular blueback speller that Keith was telling you about. There many, many changes in each edition. The author's hand is very visible in subsequent editions. But after the second edition of American Cookery, in other words, the Albany edition that came out in the first year, in 1796, after that second edition, there were no significant revisions to American Cookery. So the question must arise, was the author unable to make changes? It was the practice of the day to do so. The book has a sort of cast in amber feeling that implies that if Simmons ever existed, she had left the scene soon after the second edition came out. If she had died, which she may have, news of her death would likely have spread among the close-knit network of printer publishers in this region we're showing you from where the book's subsequent printings came out. We have a lot to say in our book about that network of printing and publishing in the late 18th century, and they talked to each other. They knew what was going on. They could then feel that they could drop her name from the title page when they were coming out with their printing with impunity, but they would leave an American orphan because the sentimental pull would attract buyers. So there's no conclusive evidence about that, but it's a speculation of ours. Is there any conclusive evidence that Amelia Simmons ever existed? I mean, outside of the title page of the book. Now, someone answering to that name certainly filed copyright for the book in April 1796, and this notice, which appeared in May 9, 1796 in the Hartford Courant, attests to that. Be it remembered that on the 28th day of April, so someone stood before Simeon Baldwin, clerk of the District of Connecticut, to file copyright notice. The notice goes on to include the lengthy title of the book, and then it ends with "in conformity to the federal copyright law." So our question is, who stood there before Simeon Baldwin in 1796? The historians Christopher Bickford and Jeffrey Kamewitz put it this way: if Amelia Simmons lived in Connecticut in 1796, she has managed to elude all genealogical research. They raised the possibility that the name was a pseudonym. with more powerful, now they made their statement in 1985, and of course we have a lot more powerful research tools at our disposal now. So Keith and I, in working on the book, redid the search for Amelia Simmons in the genealogical databases and also in print sources that they had done in 1985. And we found one intriguing item. Oh, that's just highlighting that. So this is the intriguing item. This is from the November 28, 1796 issue of the Connecticut Current. It's a death notice. And we've got the arrow to the part we're concerned with. Died at New York, Miss Amelia Simons, late of Windham, Connecticut, obviously. The date is 7 months after the copyright filing of the first edition of American Cookery and 4 weeks after the second edition. Was advertised in the Albany Gazette. The Gazette was owned by Charles R. and George Webster, the publishers of the Albany edition, and they were, by the way, protégés of Hudson and Goodwin. They were kind of offshoots of them. So there are some striking parallels between Amelia Simmons and Amelia Simons. Amelia Simons, by the way, died at the age of 29, and we do know more about her. Genealogical research does provide more information about her. Simons was not an orphan by today's standards, but in the late 18th century, the legal definition of orphanhood was the loss of one's father, and her father had abandoned the family. Her mother filed for divorce, which was a common reason for filing for divorce in the 18th century as well, abandonment. So we speculate, was the young Amelia Simons, did she go out to service in wealthy households, gentry households in Hartford to help support her family? Because obviously her mother would have been destitute, or at least, very short on funds. She might have gained experience as a cook and also connections in those households. And maybe partly to protect her identity, she would add an M to her name and publish as Amelia Simmons. It's also sometimes, as you know from doing genealogical research, it can be an alternate. Spellings are very common at the time. She produced a work that included a lot of old British classics that people love to eat and that she may have cooked. And then she included some vernacular dishes that she enjoyed, dishes that were well known in the area but for the first time to come into print. And she put them all under really a very bold title, American Cookery. While we only can really speculate about real-life Amelia Simons writing as Amelia Simmons, the question relates to the widespread 18th century practice of publishing anonymously and pseudonymously. So we're going to just tell you a little bit about that. This kind of gives you a sense of how we went about doing the research. If you know the period, things become a little clearer. Anonymous and pseudonymous publishing was widely practiced in the late 18th century for various reasons, and one reason was political. This is by, you can see written in Samuel Adams. He published both ways. Here's a number of essays by Samuel Adams, and see all the different names he published under. He was Vindex, TZ, Candidas, Shippen, etc. Ben Franklin attributed Sam Adams's penchant for pseudonyms, and other American rebels followed the same practice. What Franklin said is that it was the desire to convince the public that the discontents were really general and not the fiction of a few demagogues. So in other words, it looks like a lot of people are involved in this publication, and it's all Samuel Adams. So that was one reason for pseudonyms. Another, for women, was modesty. Sometimes women didn't want their names in print, so they would use something sort of, fancy, make them sound like a lady, Constantia. Or, this is one such work, or this novel by a lady of Massachusetts. We often see by a lady or by a lady of somewhere. But Franklin himself is probably the most famous example of pseudonymity in the 18th century. This is much earlier in the century. In 1722, as a young printer's apprentice to his brother James and his shop, Ben Franklin so inventively created a character through letters. This character's name was Silence Dogood, and she had a very controversial and colorful life. And he published these letters in his brother's flagging Boston newspaper, the Boston New England Current, and it really revived sales. I mean, people couldn't wait to hear more about what was going on with Silence Dogood. You know, lots, let me tell you, if you ever go and look at the letters, lots was going on with Silence. But it was really Benjamin Franklin. And this was a story of the success of a pseudonymous publication that was well known by printers and would have been remembered later in the century. So we speculate, was that kind of pseudonym invented by Hartford's Hudson and Goodwin? Here's a picture of George Goodwin, to promote the sale of a cookbook because they needed a woman's name on the title page. These are just some of the possibilities of what's behind Amelia Simmons. Whoever its author may have been, the topic of orphanhood, interestingly, is now really intimately bound up with the story of our first national cookbook. So what's up with orphanhood? Now, at the same time that American Cookery was published, stories about female orphans were extremely popular in both Britain and America. This is a novel, Simple Story, by the English author Mrs. Inchbald, Elizabeth Inchbald. It was a bestseller of the day. Here's another one, The Hapless Orphan, was published in Boston in 1793. The kind of popular reading that women were doing was often about orphanhood. It dramatizes the threats to virginity that Simmons has implied were a constant problem for female orphans. The social preoccupation with virginity and virtue, and here's a kind of typical illustration of a woman who's been sexually assaulted or assaulted in some way. These were very popular novels. So the preoccupation with virtue of orphaned young women portrayed in these stories helps provide a context for what we were talking about earlier, the kind of anomalous discourse in the prefaces to the first two editions of American Cookery. And it also may help explain why it was important to put an American orphan as a tagline to the author's name. Of course, we have only fragments of the story behind the first American cookbook, but we'll conclude with one little anomaly in the two editions. To set the scene now for just a moment, in the 18th century world, boys were often taught to read and write, while girls were taught only to read. This was for practical reasons. Writing was considered a male job-related skill, something for ministers and shipping clerks, but girls who were destined to be housewives did not need penmanship, basically, as a skill. They tended to learn their letters. That's a final slide from that American lady. They tended to learn their letters using a needle and thread, and these samplers are an example of how girls tended to learn their letters rather than writing with a pen. In spite of this, in New England in particular, literacy rates among women, including rudimentary writing skills, increased throughout the 18th century until 70 to 80% rates were common, even in rural areas in the late 18th century, areas like Vermont. New Englanders took pride in the fact that the region was literate, that people could read and generally could write. Literacy was assumed, by the way, literacy was measured by the ability to sign your name. Female orphans were, however, among the least likely to be able to learn to write because their education ended so soon in their life. So when American Cookery's author, so knowing this background about literacy helps us unpack this little mystery. When American Cookery's author says in the first edition that she didn't have sufficient education, an education sufficient to prepare the work for the press, and when she laments in the preface of the second edition all those disadvantages which usually attend an orphan, her readers would probably have understood her to mean that she couldn't write. And she would have been the object of their sympathy and all the more congratulated for bringing a book into print, for becoming an author. With this eye to the issue, some details of the book's 2 title pages become more meaningful. In the first, or Hartford edition, Simmons's name is given typographically in imitation of what was known at the time as Italian hand. There were different forms of penmanship, and this was the form that ladies tended to use. We speculate that the publishers realized that the fancy script that is associated with Amelia Simmons was not appropriate to the status of an orphan who was complaining that she lacked an education sufficient to prepare the work for the press. So they changed it in the second edition to, block letters, Amelia Simmons. So those are just some of the mysteries that we've worked on in working on our book, United Tastes, and trying to unpack this really fabulous book, a part of our national culture that we hope will be a more important part of our national story. We hope we've convinced you today that American Cookery, the first American cookbook, is really a remarkable book, and its author, whether real or imaginary, is a splendid personification of the challenges and opportunities that a female would face, and a female cook in particular, trying to lift herself into print in the early years of our nation. This is a story that we really enjoy pursuing, Keith and I. We feel that those such as orphans, cooks, lower status females have left little behind in the historical record. Their lives seemed at the time little worth registering, but they're well worth chronicling in our day, we now know. It sometimes takes some contextual work to dig out their stories, but the more fully they're told, the more full our American story is. So we thank you very much for listening to us today about United Tastes and the story of the making of the first American cookbook. And we'll be happy to entertain any questions you might have. Yeah, sure.
Has the cookbook itself been reproduced and available? Has the cookbook itself been reproduced and available either in print or online or some way?
Yes.
Yes. You answered, I'll go get a copy.
Yes, and in fact, we brought with us, displayed at the table in the back, but we might pass them around since you asked the question. There are modern reprint facsimile editions of both of the first 2 editions. This one here is the Hartford edition, and that one's the second edition, the Albany edition. And then this one's a little different. This was brought out by under the sponsorship of the American Antiquarian Society, in Worcester, Mass. And it has the original typography on one page, and then facing it is a modern transcription. So yes, they're readily available. They've been in print. Scholarship about, or attention to American cookery kind of disappeared after that 1831 edition that Kathy showed you a shot of the title page of that. It really disappeared from people's publishing. Changed. Publishing got to be totally concentrated in the bigger cities after that, and all these kind of small town provincial things kind of fell into oblivion. So the book was really forgotten until the middle of the 20th century. And a woman, a scholar named Mary Tolford Wilson, wrote an article about it, and then she edited. There's an introduction. She edited this facsimile of the Hartford edition and wrote an introduction that kind of put it somewhat in context. So ever since then, that was in the late 1950s, these modern reprints have been readily available. And actually, maybe I shouldn't reveal this, but the facsimile of that facsimile edition of the Albany edition is available for free in the Google Books, the whole thing. Why, I don't know, but it is. And I have to admit that we availed ourselves of that fact in doing our research.
We bought the book as well, of course. But there has been really a renewed interest in American cookery since Tolford Wilson. But even more to the point, since the kind of the rise of foodies and the interest in food and the interest in culinary
We should probably talk.
history, and the interest in culinary history, there's been this increased interest in American cookery, and you often see it referred to by food writers in newspapers and food magazines, and also by scholars. But our feeling was, and we talk about this in our book, it wasn't really contextualized. It wasn't really understood where this book came from. So sometimes mistakes were made about what kind of book it was. So anyway.
And of course, without that emphasis on the context, people don't know how important Connecticut was, not just to this book, but in general. So, in fact, that was one of the
Yeah.
that was one of the things that piqued our interest when we decided we wanted to try to work on this. Was why was it published? Why wasn't it published in? After all, if it was one of these things that was trying to broaden the definition of American independence, the places that were associated with American nationhood at this time were either New York, which is where the federal government first, set up shop, or Philadelphia, where then it moved there. Or if it was going to be in New England, why wasn't it Boston? So we were intrigued by the fact that it was published in Hartford, and before long we discovered all these interesting things about what Connecticut was like then and how that might have fit into the fact that it was published there.
So do you think whether or not there was an actual Amelia Simmons, that all of those complaints about the vagaries of being an orphan were put in to kind of
Boost sales?
sell? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Do you want to?
Yeah, we don't come to hard and fast conclusions in our book, but it does seem that the dialogue between one of the most popular themes for the best-selling novels of the era was orphanhood and the struggles of females. And before doing this work, no one had really clearly said, well, what's all this stuff doing in the preface of a cookbook? I mean, it is, after all, a cookbook. You might think that the cook author would say, a preface would say, here's the great food I have, and here's how it's going to taste, and here's what's distinctively American about it. She really says virtually nothing about that, all about orphanhood or the trials of tribulations of being a female working. So we do think that it is probably most likely because there was clearly an effort to sell American cookery. It was, by the way, the cheapest book, the least expensive book on the market at the time. Of all those books we showed you, the British reprints that were printed in with American editions at that time, American cookery was the least expensive. So it's clearly appealing.
By a lot, right? Less than half of the next one up.
Right. So it was in a simple binding, somewhat like the blueback speller. So it was appealing to females with limited resources who were trying to come up in the world, who were trying to make a more genteel dinner, to serve, gradually come up, cook nice dishes. But we think that the orphanhood angle probably had most to do with sales. Now, there isn't the genealogical evidence about Amelia Simmons per se, so we don't know that it's not simply factual.
But
It just seems strange that the publisher would have put in all those complaints.
well, we have something to
Yes.
say about that, and it's not unknown that controversy is a good form of publicity. There was a couple of examples in this period. One in particular that was pretty well known. Thomas Paine, when he published Common Sense, the famous thing that helped make the American Revolution, the pamphlet that helped make it, he got into a dispute with the printer of the first edition, a really bitter one, because the printer brought out a second edition without his permission, and then he issued another edition from a different printer, and they had a big controversy in the newspapers. And they called each other these names like reptile and, the 18th century equivalent of scumbag and all these things. And according to the historian that we got this information from, she said it boosted sales of Common Sense, at least in Philadelphia, where they knew all about it, by a great deal. So we do think that that in the case of, we don't have conclusive proof, but if there was a real person that went under the name Amelia Simmons, it might have been Amelia Simons. She probably was genuinely upset. The errata page was first put in this later printings of the Hartford edition because there were in fact mistakes in the recipes, and
Yeah.
there's a list of corrections on the page that we didn't show you in the slide. She perhaps, being not that well educated and maybe not all that familiar with the manners and everything that went with moving in these circles, that she gave vent to her, her grievance with this language, like, that this person deliberately, made these mistakes to mess up the sales. And then, and she didn't let go of that, with the person with her, kind of background and inexperience with all of this. And we think, it's not implausible that there was a circle of people around this Connecticut Wits group and these publishers that brought her forward, that encouraged her, that helped her. And when they saw that she was angry about this, they figured, let her say it, and it might not hurt the prospects and the sales of the book. So that's.
So you have to, it's kind of like, you take it at one level that it may well have been her statement of what she's saying. You take it at another level when you realize that in the context that many people found that it was advantageous to put controversy in print in their materials. I mean, some people say that what made Thomas Paine's work so famous was the controversy rather than the content of Common Sense.
I think your point about the whole literary interest in orphans is very well taken, and you see that go further in the next decades with authors such as Charlotte Bronte, Jane Austen.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
And they were women trying to make
Yep.
it in the literary world.
that's right.
Yeah.
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 I have two questions. One is I'm going to try to articulate as clearly as I can because I've got a lot of thoughts in my head. The second one's simple. But so I'm thinking about the context of the recipes. You mentioned that about 30% were essentially British influenced.
Well, actually copied verbatim almost.
Okay. So then I'm thinking of the other 70%. The first part of that is where it came from. So I noticed in the ingredients there was sugar, rum, there's meat. So it's an indication to me that these were recipes of wealth, and particularly think of the sugar and the slave trade. So most likely in that period, people that were making these recipes needed to have money. And I'm thinking because she didn't have the education, perhaps that she might have been part of the house staff that was responsible for preparing the food, and that the recipes may have been handed down, collected. I'm wondering, that's where the other 70% of the recipes came from, and what her role may have been as far as as I said, the servant or house staff or somebody responsible for preparing the food for the family. That's the more complicated question. And the second one is, I'm curious about the F replacing the S. What is the reason for that?
Well, that was simply a standard form of the typography in the 18th century. They drew S's that looked to us like F's. Although I don't know, there are some cases where S is given the way that we're familiar with, and some where it's the other way. And I'm not quite sure what are the situations where they use one and what's the other. You don't know, do you?
I think at the end it's a standard S, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
But on the question of her position in the household, it's very likely that she was the cook. She was the cook for a wealthy gentry household. But the point about the book is that its inexpensive selling price and its format is that several things. One is that it was not uncommon, as Keith was talking about plagiarism, to take recipes from more expensive books, put them into a cheaper edition and sell them to people so that this information could spread. Just like we might open Vogue magazine to see what diamonds are being sold today. Now, it doesn't mean we're buying them, but we get access to the information about them. So, you know, access to these recipes was more broad than just the class for whom they were originally written. The other point about the recipes, and we have a section in our book analyzing American cookery in relation to what are basically manuscript collections of recipes that were used in households, is that indeed many recipes were collected in households over generations, and that was the most common form of transmitting written receipts or recipes. And so some of them would have been perhaps even unknown where they came from. Maybe they had been copied so many times. And her collection is not unlike other collections that were never published from this very area at that time.
But just to kind of correct something that you said, there are about 1/3 of them that are actually copied from British cookbooks. There's even more, like around 40%, that are British. That they're not directly copied, but they're of a type that was very common in British cookbooks. So when you were asking where 70% of the recipes came from, 75% of them came from the British culinary tradition. Some directly copied, the rest a type that's very familiar. So that leaves about 20% that, in other words, we found in British cookbooks from the 18th century, many recipes of that same type. So that leaves about 20% that we didn't find any, obvious example of in some other book. All of the ones that, use American ingredients, the ones that we're calling the American recipes, are of that type. And there's some others that we don't particularly think of as distinctively American, but that are also that way. So they presumably came from the author's own invention, or she heard about them from somebody else, or wherever. But is that responsive to your question?
Yeah, I was still curious too, because I think there was the Indian pudding, so that must have been passed down from someone regionally, at least.
Yeah, no. The majority of the recipes that we would think of as American are the ones that have Indian meal, that is cornmeal, in them, or other ones with New World ingredients like pumpkin.
And it's clear from these manuscripts that women knew about these dishes and were cooking them in their families. This is the first instance of them coming into print. So she had, whoever she was, or if she was a combination of people or a pseudonym, she brought it to the wider public in print.
And also, I also wanted to say something when you're saying that a lot of the recipes called for expensive ingredients, and that's true. The majority, in this other way of grouping them that I mentioned, where some you would say are pretty plain and have simple ingredients and don't require much skill to cook, some have more elaborate techniques and fancier ingredients, and some have the most of both of the, highest degree of both of those things. If you relate that to the fact that it was cheap and short, both editions, the book is the first edition is 47 pages, the second is 64 pages. People may not have been able to very frequently have the fancier dishes with all these fancy, expensive ingredients, but I think it's fair to say that the desire, the aspiration, was widespread. So they might have bought the book even though they couldn't make all the things in it all the time. A lot of people that think about and write about food and cookbooks now, and the role of cookbooks now, say that mainly they are aspirational. Nobody's going to cook, 250 recipes with, all the very elaborate techniques that are called for, and with all the sumptuous photography that's always put into them and everything. But the purpose of that is to say, if you want to at least kind of raise up, float in this, really elegant realm, at least for a little while. Every so often, this will allow you to do it. And that's the same role with this little book, we think.
And just as, you know, Keith was describing the consumer revolution, it doesn't mean everyone went out and bought the full set of dinnerware, but a woman might bring home a fancy cup and saucer. So it's the same sort of thing. You know, you're gradually being kind of brought into a world of more refinement. Yeah, anyway, so we've gone on for a while. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm curious about the I'm curious about the errata page. Could you tell from that page what mistakes were made by the transcriber? Was it someone who didn't know how to cook and so therefore made cooking errors, or was it
Good question.
very willful mistakes?
Well, the errors, the errors in the she complains about the errors, you know, in the number of like eggs, you know, I forget the details, but you know, many more than are required, or this amount of that. But again, the question is always: is it intentional, or is this itself a construct to generate controversy? It may well have been. As she says, it could have been a blunder or an evil intention. It could have been either. It could well have been someone who knew how to write and was writing down what she was describing to include, but wasn't a cook himself or herself, and therefore didn't really understand that as cooks do, that it really makes a big difference. So, but interestingly, the errata page did not survive in later printings. So,
as a matter of fact, not only did the errata page not survive, but this whole controversy with the transcriber and all this talk about the design to injure the sale and evil intention and everything, that went out in all the later editions too. What they kept was this kind of sentimental tale of, you know, the perils of female orphanhood, which it was thought, and you know, and they also kept, as Kathy was describing, the generic identity of orphan or American orphan on the title page. But
So they didn't, I assume that in the second edition in Albany they corrected the mistakes that were in the first edition.
yes,
They did.
uh,
So that's why you would.
they did, yes. Interestingly, we're keeping you a long time here, but I'll just throw this in too, on that thing about how keeping of this orphanhood theme all through all these later printings. I showed you that slide of this book that was published in Vermont in 1808 called the New England Cookery, large parts of which were verbatim plagiarism of American cookery. That retains this whole orphanhood thing as the preface, unexplained, even though the author, Lucy, is given with a name, Lucy Emerson, and we looked into who she was, and she was, you know, the brother of the...
her brother was.
Her brother was, you know, the president of the bank in Montpelier, and she had been married and had children, and you know, was totally educated, and
So
you know,
anyone buying the book would have known that the preface had nothing to do with
nothing to do with her. It was, but they just stuck it in there because they thought, you know, well, why not? It might attract people. Anyway, I think we've kept you sitting here.
Just to clarify,
Yes.
when the use of the term Indian, we are speaking of the indigenous people of the region.
Oh, that's a great question,
yes,
Jazz.
yes, I'm sorry,
We're
thank you.
sorry. That's the foodie historian thing in us. Indian was the common. Thanks very much for saying that. Indian was the common name given to maize or cornmeal. Basically, the reason is that when the English first came, corn meant the grain of the region. So the corn of Scotland was oats, and the corn of America was maize, and they began to call it Indian corn. But Indian in the 19th century was a more common way to refer to it than corn. Corn was still considered the generic term for all grains. So it tended to be called Indian this or that, meaning corn, but Indian pudding means cornmeal pudding, basically. Thank you.
Maybe I'll add too that if you look at some of our, just for a second, that in an earlier book, our first book called America's Founding Food, we have a whole chapter on corn and about the ways in which the first settlers of New England were rather embarrassed by the fact that they had to depend for their survival in the first decades of settlement on this food that was the core of the diet of these people that they considered very inferior to themselves.
And we make a big point in the first chapter of that book to reestablish the true history of corn in the region as basically a native food.
So we thank you all for coming this afternoon, and please join us at the back table where you can get your own copy of United Tastes and get it signed by our incredible authors here. So thank you again for being with us here today.